So the DH Colloquium presentation today is what do we study when we study multilingualism, a bibliometric adjacent analysis of the field. And this is done by Robyn Berghoff and Emanuel Bylund. So Robyn, both from Stellenbosch University. Robyn is a psycholinguist interested in language acquisition as well as bilingual language representation and processing. She's currently leading a project investigating morphosyntactic representation and processing in sound, processing in second language learners at ISICOSA. And her work has appeared in outlets such as Applied Psycholinguistics, Bilingualism, Language and Cognition, Second Language Research, and Studies in Second Language Acquisition. And Emanuel is also a psycholinguist. He's specializing in linguistic relativity and sensitive periods in language acquisition and loss. His work has appeared in journals such as Bilingualism, Language and Cognition, Developmental Science, Journal of Experimental Psychology, General, and Studies in Second Language Acquisition. So I know that Emanuel has to leave in a few minutes, so I will stop talking now, and then they can take over. Robyn and Emanuel, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Menno. We'll just switch over to the screen share for a second. And we'll put on the video as well. So hopefully you can now see everything here, and I'll hand over to my colleague Menno just to start things off.
Yes, hello everybody. Welcome to this little presentation of some of the research we've been doing using bibliometric adjacent methods. And so we're interested in language acquisition, broadly speaking, and the multilingual mind. And the starting point here is that if we want to understand how the human mind works, we can't just zoom in on one particular population, which might sound like a cliche, but it has been the approach for decades in the cognitive sciences. Studying first language speakers of English was the default to gain insights into the functioning of the human mind. This has shifted now, and we're instead interested in looking at diversity to better understand not just how the mind works, but how the mind adapts to different situations and so on.
Yeah, so I'm going to take over now because Menno has to leave basically immediately. So I'll pick up where he's left off. So as you said, the cognitive sciences have historically relied on a very particular kind of sample. And that sampling bias that has been observed has gone under various names. You can call it a Western bias. So people are relying mostly on participants from the so-called Western world, or you can also call it sort of a global North bias, where participants tend to be from the global North. And if such a bias indeed is prevalent, right? So if the cognitive sciences is relying so heavily on these so-called weird samples, where this acronym WEIRD stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic, the idea is that this bias is problematic for the cognitive sciences because we can't make claims about sort of human cognition in general if we're relying very heavily on samples that consist of a particular kind of human in a particular context. So this discussion, especially since the 2010s, has really gained traction. There have been a number of publications dealing with this issue, but that has been, for the most part, concerned with the cognitive sciences more broadly. When we get to the area that we're interested in, which is multilingualism studies, second language acquisition studies, there have been concerns about sampling bias, so over-reliance on particular kinds of samples that have been voiced in the literature since around the 1980s. So these ideas in the field of multilingualism are not new, right? They've been extant for over 40 years at this point. But these sort of voicings of concerns have been kind of isolated and not picked up on all that much until relatively recently. So people have claimed in this field specifically, for example, that we rely too much on English, we rely too much on participants who are highly educated, participants in the sort of global north. But there haven't really been any empirical studies to establish that in this field of second language acquisition, multilingualism research, there is indeed a sampling bias of this sort. So our study that we're going to talk about a bit today, or that I'm going to talk about a bit today, is trying to establish this empirically. So in the field of multilingualism research, second language acquisition research, who are the actual participants that we are relying on? Where do we get the data from that we use to draw our conclusions about, how multilingualism works and how related phenomena work? So we'll talk a bit in today's presentation about a project that we did over the last couple of years. It has been published now, and the references here at the bottom of the slide. It's published in Applied Linguistics. But the aim of this project was to answer two broad questions. Firstly, how linguistically diverse is multilingualism research? And here we're interested in what are the languages that people are studying when they do research on multilingualism, right? Is it, as people have proposed, heavily sort of English dominant? Do people rely a lot on people learning English or first language speakers of English learning another language? Those kinds of concerns. And then the second aspect that we'll talk about a bit today is geographic diversity in multilingualism research. And here we're getting at that angle of sort of global north, global south, Western, non-Western. Where is the research in this field actually coming from, right? And this has implications for multilingualism research specifically because multilingualism looks different across different parts of the world, right? If you think about more monolingual societies, and we'll talk about this a bit later, language use, language learning, it's different there compared to highly linguistically diverse settings like the South African setting is. So we're interested in just kind of establishing what the picture looks like really in terms of linguistic and geographic diversity in this field. So we're defining here, importantly, multilingualism research as the study of how people acquire, use, and lose, in some cases, multiple languages. So this gives us a sort of definition of the field that we're working with. And in today's presentation specifically, because this is sort of a digital humanities colloquium, I'm going to focus particularly on the data that we collected and how we analyzed it to address certain aspects of these research questions presented earlier on this slide, right? So I'm going to lean a little bit less heavily on the results, a little bit more heavily on the methods, with the hope that you in the audience will maybe be able to take away a few things that could be useful in answering questions in your own fields. Okay, so I have roughly divided the presentation into two sections, really. And the first I'm calling the data. And within this section, I'm going to talk about defining the sort of scope of our project, what we were interested in looking at so that we knew what kinds of data we needed to collect. I'll talk a bit about how we got the core data we used for the project, how we cleaned that data to get it into a format that we could actually use to answer our questions. And then I'll talk a bit about some supplementary data that we added to this core data that we collected that helped us sort of address other aspects of our research questions. So starting off here with the defining the scope question. So we've got these very broad questions, right? How linguistically diverse, how geographically diverse is multilingualism research? We've got our definition of multilingualism research, but we needed to define a particular time scope for this project, right? So we chose 2010 to 2020, and that's inclusive of 2020. So roughly an 11-year period there. The beginning point, that 2010 moment, is a time when a lot of these publications about sampling biases in the cognitive sciences started to come out, right? The most famous one being this paper by Henrich et al. Called The Weirdest People in the World, right? Again, that weird acronym. So in theory, by starting this investigation around 2010 and adopting a little bit of a longitudinal perspective, it might allow us to identify some shifts in the field, perhaps away from the weirder samples, the more sort of Western English-dominated samples towards other kinds of samples. That is at least theoretically possible with this time span here that we've defined. We then also, of course, needed to determine where we were going to gather our multilingualism research from, right? So what exactly are we looking at in terms of research? Here we adopted sort of two criteria. The first being we relied on our own knowledge as scholars in this field to identify journals that would be relevant to include, right? And this relevance is particularly in terms of the scope of the journals. We wanted journals that publish on multilingualism research, right? So we don't want, for example, a journal that is heavily biased towards, say, first language acquisition or something like that, because that is not about multilingualism, that is about monolingualism in most cases, right? The acquisition of just a single language. So we picked out journals that we knew published the kinds of research we were interested in. And then as a secondary criterion, we used journal impact factor to identify high-ranking journals that publish in this area, right? An impact factor we retrieved from this Clarivate Journal Citations Report database that the Stellenbosch University Library subscribes to, perhaps many university libraries subscribe to as well. This gives you, for any given field that you input, a ranking of the journals in that field according to impact factor. So using these two criteria of scope and then ranking, we ended up with 5 journals. And those of you who work in the field of multilingualism / second language acquisition will probably be familiar with the names of these 5 journals. They are high impact journals or sort of high visibility journals in the field. And that has consequences, of course, for the rest of the research, which we can return to in the discussion period if we're interested in doing so. But for our purposes, we thought these are going to be good journals because they give us an indication of the kinds of research that is widely read within the field, that is likely to impact the field, right? So of course, there's plenty of other research published in other outlets, but those other outlets will be less visible than the ones that we include here. It doesn't make the research any less valuable, it just makes it less visible and therefore less likely to shape the field. So that is why we ended up with these journals that we have here, right? So then we had our time period, our selection of 5 journals, and we wanted to start out with getting our core data, right? And that is simply metadata about all of the article records published in these 5 journals in the period that was of interest for us. And this you can very easily export from a platform such as Scopus, which is what we used, right? So you can automatically export for each article, the year of publication, title of the article, the authors, author affiliations, and then citation numbers as well, right? And there's a little note in parentheses there. Of course, when we started doing this project, it was probably late 2020, somewhere around there, but the data analysis was actually happening quite a bit later, right? So at that point, the citation number downloaded from Scopus was no longer current, but luckily there are nice packages in R, for example, R Crossref, that you can use to get updated citation numbers simply by inputting the DOI numbers. So we updated those citation numbers later when the analysis was actually happening. That is a really useful package for this kind of work to do so, right? So those were our core data that we could automatically get, which was wonderful. But the really key pieces for answering our research questions you can't get automatically, but I say that with a bit of an asterisk. I think that there are probably ways to do it where you might compromise on accuracy slightly, but where the work burden would be reduced. But I'll put that aside for the second and just say we manually coded these pieces of information that we were interested in. So language understudy. In a given study, what language are they focused on? So if we take kind of a typical second language acquisition study, for example, say we've got a paper that is reporting on an experiment done with L1 speakers, first language speakers of English, learning, say, Spanish as a second language. So we would manually code in such a case that the first language, the L1 understudy here was English, first language of the participants, and the L2 of interest here was Spanish. So we did that individually for each of our studies, coded the languages under study, and we also coded the research location. So where were the data collected? And this we did at the country level. So we're talking, you know, at sort of South Africa level, United States, United Kingdom, et cetera, et cetera. That was manually coded in large parts by myself and Mana, who was just here. We also had an honors student who assisted with this, and a few other research assistants. And of course, now because we had several different people doing manual coding of these kinds of things, we also checked the inter-rater reliability between these codings, right? So we ended up there with very high numbers, so reassuringly high inter-rater reliability, showing that our judgments were pretty consistent across the board here. So that was our core data, right? That we can sort of call a pre-final end products, what I'm calling it here. And we ended up with around 1,700 articles. So that is excluding all non-empirical work, so sort of think pieces, reviews and such things we're not including. Everything that we included was reporting on empirical work conducted on multilingualism / second language acquisition. But this pre-final data was not quite in the format that it needed to be to answer some of our research questions. So we still needed to do a bit of cleaning. Some of that was really quite simple. So again, because we had multiple coders, there was a little bit of inconsistency in the labels that coders used, right? So we can think of quite a straightforward example here. Say now there are 3 people working on this data. Some people might, when they're confronted with Mandarin Chinese, they might write down in the spreadsheet Chinese as the language understudy. Someone else might call it Mandarin. A third person might label it Mandarin Chinese. If we want to actually analyze this, we want all of these things to be named consistently because they all refer to the same language. So that needs to be modified. Another example here related to language naming is dialects, right? So you could have Spanish as sort of a macro language label, but perhaps a particular study is looking at speakers of Spanish in Mexico. So the person coding the data might have written down Mexican Spanish as a language understudy, or for example, in another setting, Chilean Spanish as a language understudy. In most cases in our data, the particular dialect was not of interest in the study itself. It was only of interest in cases where people were looking at bidialectal speakers. So let's say people who speak both Peninsular Spanish and Mexican Spanish or something like that. Happened in very few cases. In those cases, we would keep the actual dialect label. In other cases, we wanted to use that macro language label. So we wanted all of those examples there in the second row here to say Spanish. Relatedly, in location naming, we would look for consistency in things like using the United Kingdom label for all of England and Wales and whichever of the Irelands is in the United Kingdom, right? That needs to be consistent as well. So this is a simple case, right? You can easily solve these inconsistencies by just sort of identifying them with your eye and then using find and replace operations to replace the undesired label with the desired label. So I do this in R, usually using the string R package. Very simple to do. But we have another set of sort of consistency issues that for me was considerably less straightforward to solve. And this was related to researchers' university affiliations. So in the geographic diversity angle of the paper that we're talking about here, we also wanted to know which institutions actually are producing most of the research here. And to get that information, you need to have nice, consistent naming of institutions across article records. But it is very common that you will see things like this in automatically exported data of this kind. So if we look at the first 2 rows in this table, one of the affiliations is listed as University of Cologne. The second row there, the label that is used is the German name for the same university, right? And if we look at the last 2 rows here, we could have the full name of a university written out, University of California in Los Angeles. But in another instance, the abbreviation might be used for that same university. And the same sort of situation as with Chinese versus Mandarin, we can't be using numbers of different labels for the same institute here. So to solve this, I'll just talk briefly through what I did. Would be interested to hear of your suggestions for more optimal workflows here, because I'm sure there are many. But what we ended up doing was to take all the unique affiliations in the data set and extract them to a separate data frame, and then edit that extracted data frame so that it would contain only the desired labels for a particular institution, right? So perhaps it would include only University of California in Los Angeles and not UCLA as well. Then I did sort of broad brush edits of the original affiliations in the original data set to, say, find and replace foreign terms. Like you can have the French université, which you can quite easily just replace with university throughout the data, right? And then once we had that sort of roughly cleaned version of the original affiliations, we did fuzzy matching between those and the extracted cleaned versions of the affiliation labels. And that means that you are sort of comparing the strings between the original version and the clean version. And then, you know, in this process, the closest match is identified. So the most similar string in the clean version would be matched with the original version. And in many cases, that gives you quite good matches. But in others, I think I left that little step out here. You still need to do manual editing where the fuzzy matching doesn't quite work, right? But once you've gone through this process, and it's a bit laborious, eventually you can drop that unedited affiliations column, the messy affiliations column, so that you have only this clean version, so that you have only something like on this slide, the only instance of a label referring to the University of Cologne would be the University of Cologne. No more German version of that, and no more abbreviated forms of, say, University of California in Los Angeles. We'd have only this one single label. So this affiliations data, I think, was really the most tricky to clean, the most time intensive to clean, I would say. But after doing that, that is really most of the cleaning that was involved. And then we had our set of core data that we combined with some supplementary data that would give us kind of a more nuanced perspective on aspects of our data. So some of the supplementary data was linguistic. For example, we wanted to get information on the language families to which our most studied languages belonged, right? And there is a very nice resource called Ethnologue that is sort of an online encyclopedia of information about these kinds of linguistic facts. So we got from their data on language families, and we also got data on the typological distance between languages. So typological distance meaning how closely a pair of languages are related, right? So English and French, for example, are typologically closer to each other than English and Xhosa are. We have here a measure of typological distance that is based on string similarity again. I won't go into this in detail now due to time constraints, but it is just relevant to note that in the eventual scale that we use, this typological distance could be measured at a minimum of 0, maximum similarity between two languages, and is approximately 100 for languages that are completely unrelated. So higher figures on this scale indicate less closely related language pairs. So that was linguistic data. In terms of geographic supplementary data, we got information on regional classifications. So for example, what do Sub-Saharan Africa and, say, the Middle East and Southeast Asia have in common? The World Bank classifies these as developing regions or global south regions, et cetera, et cetera. So we wanted to have sort of objective labels for these kinds of things to make meaningful distinctions between geographies around the world. And something else that we'll also talk about a bit, at the country level, there is a measure of linguistic diversity that is available. This, again, we retrieved from Ethnologue. And this measure, which is called the Linguistic Diversity Index, it reflects the likelihood of two randomly selected people from a given country sharing the same first language, right? So actually, I think it's measured in terms of having different first languages, sorry. So a country with a really high linguistic diversity index, so I think South Africa is somewhere at 0.8 or so, two randomly selected people, there is like an 80% chance that they would not share the same first language. But in a very homogeneous or less diverse country, like Iceland, for example, any two randomly selected people are probably going to have the same first language, and it's probably going to be Icelandic, right? So this also gives us sort of a relevant piece of information about linguistic context within a given country. Okay, so that is the data. I'll talk now a little bit about the findings, again, trying to highlight ways of analysis or ways of presenting this that we use that might be useful for your own research as well. So I'll start with the linguistic diversity findings and then move on to the geographic diversity findings. So for linguistic diversity, we started with this very sort of zoomed out view of what are the most commonly occurring languages in this data. So we've got around 1,700 articles published across more than a decade in these high impact journals. What languages do these papers tend to study, right? In the entire data set, we had 183 unique languages. So it's not a tiny number. It's also not a massive number because there are more than 7,000 languages in the world, right? And in terms of language families, and that was data that we retrieved from Ethnologue, again, there are 30 different language families represented in the data, and around 35% of the languages in the data are from the Indo-European family, right? So this is all of our Germanic languages, all of our Romance languages, Slavic languages, these are all part of that family, right? So the Indo-European family is very much dominant. The top 20 languages in the sample, the 20 most frequently occurring languages in the sample are here in this table. The 20 most studied languages, they account for around 84% of all the languages in the sample, right? So in other words, 84% of studies in the sample focus on one of these 20 languages here. And you'll see, unsurprisingly, that English is the most studied language, so accounting for around 27% of study focuses. 27% of studies are primarily interested in English, but you've got other large languages there that are, you know, sort of likely suspects in this area as well, right? Spanish, Mandarin Chinese, French, German, etc. That is a very macro level perspective on languages in the data, because we are also interested in representing this visually. We have two visualizations here. Indo-European languages, which were the largest family in the study, we have visualized in this figure. You'll see English at the bottom there is really by far the most dominant, both overall and in terms of languages within this particular family that showed up in the sample. But then we've got Spanish, French, German, etc., going all the way up to languages that really only occur once or twice in the sample. And you'll see by how quickly those bars shrink as you go up this y-axis here, you can see that most languages are only occurring a very small handful of times in the data, right? So there's a few languages that are studied a lot and lots of languages that are studied very little, right? We have the same visualization
I've lost the presenter. Am
Yeah,
I the
I'm
only
afraid,
one?
no, I'm afraid that we all lost the presenter. I think we just have to wait a little bit. Hopefully she'll come back soon. There were some load shedding issues, but that might not be the case now. So I think we just have to wait for a little bit.
Thanks.
Okay, it seems that electricity, where presenter is, so the electricity in the building where she is has gone out, and she's trying her best to come back in. So hopefully she'll be back soon. Okay, it seems that there was an issue with the generator, but it looks like Robyn is coming back at this moment.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome back, Robyn.
Thank you. It seems we've had a generator failure here. I'm really sorry about that. I'm trying to operate now via mobile hotspot. So, yeah, it'll hopefully hold up for a little while. Is it okay if I just sort of skip a little bit and yeah, I guess jump towards the end of things?
Sure, please do. Thanks.
Yeah, so language findings, we had them. We also looked at order of acquisition because we're interested in SLA/multilingualism things. It's often relevant to know what is the first language that people have when they're learning a particular second language, say, because there are influences of the first language on second language acquisition process. So we've got here data on the most common L1s in the sample, first languages in the sample, mostly English, and also the most common L2s in the sample, again, mostly English here. We also have data on the pairs of languages that show up in the sample. So what are the, say, L1, L2 combinations? On the left-hand side of this slide, we have the L1 combinations for people studying so-called simultaneous bilinguals, people who grow up with two languages. Then on the right-hand side, we have our most common L1, L2 pairs. And you'll see that in almost all of these, English is a member of the pair in each case. That is true for all of the L1, L2 pairs and for almost all of the L1, L1 simultaneous bilingualism pairs. And you'll see here that we also have a representation of these language pairings visually. So this is a network plot that shows the language pairs that show up in the data. The width of these lines here is proportional to the frequency of the pairing in the data set. So you'll see English, Spanish, for example, that's a really thick line. That's because that pair shows up a lot. Same with English, Chinese, the thin lines are pairs that show up less frequently. And dot size here is proportional to the frequency of the specific language in the data. So English has a big dot, lots of instances of English. Let's see, Croatian has a relatively small dot, not so many instances of that. So this gives also kind of a nice visual indication of what kinds of combinations of languages are being studied in this field of research. I'm going to skip over that and move on just in the last little while here to, I think, two more things. One thing that we were interested in was the mention in article titles of language names. And this interest stems from a sort of other observation made about research conducted in sort of the so-called global north versus the global south. The observation being that research conducted in the global south, the article title often mentions the location of the research, right? So you would see something like kinship practices in Nigeria or something like that, right? Whereas if you have research conducted in the global north, it is less likely to say something about where exactly that research was conducted. So you might then just have sort of a very vague title like kinship practices in a developed society or something like that, right? Even that developed society is a little bit of a mention, but yeah, the general trend being that these things tend to be less geographically particular. And the implication of this behavior that people have observed is that knowledge produced in the global south tends to be positioned as very particular, as not generalizable, right? So kinship practices in Nigeria, it seems to say this is knowledge about Nigeria. It doesn't necessarily apply everywhere. Whereas if, you know, the research is positioned as not being geographically specific, the implication is that this knowledge is kind of universal, right? It applies everywhere. So we wanted to see whether a similar kind of trend can be observed in this language research domain, right? And in our case, we're interested in, does the paper title mention the language under study, right? So here, basically, I'm gonna skip over this, but we calculated a mention rate for each language in the study. So if we look, for example, at this little table at the bottom of this slide, say we've got 3 papers here that are focused on Spanish. In two of those, the first two rows, Spanish is actually mentioned in the paper title. In the last row, Spanish is not mentioned. So if we want to calculate a mention rate here, we've got 3 studies on Spanish. 2 of them mention Spanish in the title. That's a mention rate of 66%, let's say, just for example, right? It's not actual data. But if we look across more commonly and less commonly studied, languages with very high mention rates that tend to be mentioned in the article title, they are rarely studied languages. They don't occur a lot in the sample, whereas languages with lower mention rates tend to be much more frequent in the sample. So English, for example, it's the most commonly studied language in our sample, has a mention rate of less than 20%. So fewer than 1 out of 5 studies on English would actually mention in the title that they're on English. So if we think about these 2 examples from the actual data. So we have here an article title that mentions this very rare language combination, Jedek Jahai. So these are languages spoken in Malaysia. They are, very understudied, very infrequent in the sample. This article title makes it very clear what the language understudy is, right? Whereas if we look at something like exploring early language detection in balanced bilingual children, no mention of the language combination, we can expect that that paper would be reporting on something like English-French or French-German, something that is very common in the data, right? So we see sort of a parallel here with other research where research on languages that are less commonly studied, it tends to position itself as sort of more particular, more unique, less universal, whereas that is not true for research on languages that are more commonly studied. I'm going to skip over this bit. This is just a little citation analysis, simple to do with the data that we have. We have, for our results related to geographic diversity, here just an indication of the most frequently occurring university affiliations in our data. You'll see those are basically all from the US, the UK, and Europe. And in terms of actual research locations in our data, they're visualized here with color coding indicating so-called global north regions versus global south regions, right? The United States is by far the most dominant here, and then we've got sort of the UK and a couple of European countries, and then some well-represented East Asian regions as well here. But Sub-Saharan Africa is really very poorly represented, for example. If we map these research locations, they look something like this, right? So this is a heat maps also created in R, where our bright red regions are the locations that are really well represented, and our paler or blank regions are regions that are poorly represented in the data. Again, here you see Sub-Saharan Africa in terms of the continents is really the one that is almost absent from the research. And we contrast this with that metric that I mentioned earlier of the linguistic diversity index, right? So that is, again, the sort of likelihood of people sharing a first language. In the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, again, you'll see it's very, very red. Here, it's actually the likelihood that people don't share a language. Again, I correct myself. So their linguistic diversity is super high, right? People are likely to have different first language backgrounds. There are lots of languages present in society. India, for example, and Southeast Asia, they are also very red, very diverse regions, whereas, say, the United States is really paler in color, right? The implication here being that research on multilingualism is not necessarily conducted in highly multilingual areas, right? It's not necessarily a problem per se. Obviously, it's valuable to do research everywhere. But if we want to know things about multilingualism, we also really need to consider these highly linguistically diverse regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, India, Southeast Asia, etc. Right? So I'll just really quickly go through these as takeaways, right? So the language sampling is not representative of the true linguistic diversity in the world. And our geographic bias that we observe in the study, it has consequences for our knowledge in this area of multilingualism research because countries that are highly multilingual are poorly represented. And we didn't talk about it here, but longitudinally, I mean, it is a short window that we looked at, but there's little evidence of an increase in diversity. In terms of general takeaways, I hope that this highly interrupted presentation could at least illustrate to some extent the kind of promise that publicly accessible data sets hold for this kind of secondary research that looks at what is going on in particular fields, right? So at least in our field, in linguistics, people are really interested in doing sort of studies of the studies at the moment. And I imagine this extends to other realms as well. So I hope this gave some ideas for the kinds of possibilities here. Thank you very much for listening and for your patience with all of these technical difficulties. And I'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Robyn. And yeah, it's unfortunate that we lost a bit of time due to technical issues, but we still actually have some time for discussion, which is really nice. I see there is one question in the chat. So if other people have questions, please just write it in the chat and then we can tackle it there. Tuli says, is the application of multilingualism feasible, particularly in the pedagogical and academic domains?
So that's a very interesting question. It's a very complicated question as well. It's not really one that our data speaks to strongly. I think it would be interesting, though, to do a similar kind of thing for looking exactly at this question, right? So there is a wealth of research on pedagogical applications of multilingualism, right? So multilingual teaching strategies, translanguaging, etc. But where is most of that research done and in what contexts, right? So I think when you want to answer such a broad question as that question, right, is it feasible to use these kinds of strategies? If we want an evidence-based answer to that, we need to know where the data is coming from that we draw conclusions on, right? So just for example, and it's not really an area that I'm an expert in, but I think there is quite a lot of this translanguaging work done, for example, in the US, where they're looking at sort of English-Spanish bilinguals, but that's a very different context to, say, the South African context, where there is a lot more multilingualism. There's often fewer resources available, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, that was a very roundabout answer, but I think my suggestion would just be we actually need to answer that question, to examine the research a bit more carefully.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure if there are any other questions. I don't see anything in the chat yet. I had a few.
Sorry, I had a question, but I tried
typing
typing it, but it's taking me too long. Can I quickly
voice
it?
Sure.
So it's more a comment than a question, really. So I found it interesting that in your analysis of the articles, you said if the study has been done in English, that isn't explicitly mentioned. And
right.
It made me really think of a push in natural language processing, computational linguistics, which is my field, where people are really advocating nowadays to say, make it clear in your papers what languages you're working on, even if it is English, just to give sort of prepare the stage for other languages and to make it easier for people to know, oh, what is this all about, and not just sort of implicitly think, oh, it must be, it's English, right? So they have to be more explicit about that. And I think it's interesting to see that it's not just in our field that happens, but that English is sort of seen as a standard in your field as well, to a certain degree. So to me, that was a nice takeaway.
Yeah, I think it is very interesting. And when we were looking at some of these studies doing this manual coding, especially for a slightly related project, we were looking at these very, very high impact journals, Science, Nature, etc. So there's not all that much on language published in those journals, but of the stuff that is there, you would be astonished that there is no mention whatsoever in the actual article what language they are looking at, right? So it'll be something about like, some processing thing that they're doing, and they've done an experiment, but nowhere in the paper does it say what language they were looking at. To actually find that out, we needed, in many cases, to go into the supplementary materials made available on the journal webpage. Then you end up downloading this Microsoft Word document that is meant to accompany the publication. And only in the example stimulus from the experiment do you get to figure out that, oh, okay, they were doing this on English. So the kind of under specification is really quite shocking. And that it happens when the research is on English. You don't get that same underspecification if you're doing something on isiZulu, for example.
Yeah, absolutely
Thanks.
agree. That's interesting. Thanks.
I was actually personally thinking the other way around. Should we start not mentioning languages if we're looking at specific languages? I see there's another question in the chat. I haven't read the paper, but have you extended your study to categorize the subjects or focus of the studies based on location? If you haven't, do you think there would be a difference? Great study, by the way. Many thanks for the presentation.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. We have, not for this particular paper, but we have a related paper where we looked specifically at psycholinguistic research. So that one is still in preparation. But for that paper, we did sort of try and divide studies based on their topic within psycholinguistics. And the topics that we worked with were things like language comprehension, language production, sort of language and cognition questions that have to do more with language and thought. We had 5 of these topics, and we did look at, to some extent, at geographic differences across these kinds of things. And you do find, for example, that in this area of language and cognition, just as an example, something that people are very interested in is the relationship between colored terms in a language and color perception. And there is a study called the World Color Survey, right? It's really a database that is to do with that. And that database contains data from languages all around the world, right? Really quite small languages in very understudied regions. So it's quite diverse in nature, but it's only on that very specific topic, right? And the sort of impression that one gets, even without doing a systematic analysis, is that in these, one would almost want to call them, they're kind of less strictly linguistic in focus, but more about general cognition. Diversity, both geographic and linguistic, seems to be higher there, but it's because that research demands difference in language structure, right? So people really have to be very systematic in determining which language pairs they want to examine, for example. So you need to make sure that the languages that you're including use actually different color terms, right? So you can't just randomly use, say, English, Spanish bilinguals because those are the most convenient bilinguals there. So the kind of takeaway that we had from that observation was just that it is possible for increased diversity to exist. It is possible to do research that relies on lesser studied languages, etc. But people tend to do it at this point only when the research question really demands it. So no one is going out of their way really to test the generalizability of say, theories developed based on English. But when the research question really necessitates use of a structurally different language, people actually, they can manage to do that kind of research. That answers the question to some extent.
Great, thank you. I think it does. If not, then we'll see something in the chat. I also realize we're running slightly over time. I still have a few minutes. If people want to stay for a little bit more discussion, that's fine with me. If it's still fine with you, Robyn.
Yeah, sure.
Because we did lose a little bit of time, but I also realized that people might have other appointments and might need to leave. I don't see any other questions in the chat at this moment. I had a few. Okay, so I do see. Yeah, great, thanks. I had a few more kind of methodological questions and just out of curiosity. So the way I've done reviews is more taking a look at the database, something like Google Scholar, and then search articles using keywords. I'm not saying that what you've done is not a good thing. I actually wonder, will it change the results? Because I think your approach is more structured in a way.
Yeah, we have thought quite a bit about this. So of course, I mean, one of the main questions that you get with this kind of thing is, it's based exactly on this journal selection question. So people will say, Yeah, but of course you've selected journals that are, headquartered in the so-called global north. The requirements to publish in such journals, in some cases, it makes it really difficult to publish studies on understudied languages in those journals. Say, for example, because it's difficult to get large numbers of participants if you're working with a small language. Institutes that are based in countries with fewer resources, they might not have the equipment to do the kinds of research that these publications favor. So yeah, the implication being the landscape might look quite a bit different if you did include different journals, or if you just, cast the net extremely wide, and really just use something like a keyword approach where you just get everything on, say, SLA or multilingualism research. So we've thought about doing something like that, probably within Scopus or similar. So you would still have a bit of a boundary or a filter, I suppose. Google Scholar, I guess, includes also, dissertations and things like that, where, I mean, it's not to say that you couldn't include them, but it would be something you'd have to take into account. But I think it would be interesting to do it on a sort of a less filtered scale and see what things look like. There is also the consideration of language of publication. So I think in Brazil, for example, there's quite a vibrant Portuguese publishing scene. What are they publishing on? I mean, it's probably a lot of English and Portuguese, one imagines, but that is just an assumption, right? So it's also there is some aspects of the publishing landscape that we miss by focusing only on English publications as well.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a good point. I hadn't even thought of that. And I realized that a keyword-based approach or something like Google Scholar requires a lot of cleanup. I was curious at the beginning, but you mentioned it afterwards, how many articles you found, but it's a decent number. So yeah, if you do a keyword-based search, you probably get even more, and that will just require a lot of cleanup.
Yeah. We so for this related study that we have been working on, we did a time span that was double, so it was 2 decades, and there we ended up with over 5,000 publication records. So it's still, I mean, people have done this. That study that I mentioned that looked at sort of location naming and article titles, they just pulled data from Scopus without any kind of filtering, except for, I think it needed to be social sciences and humanities. And they work with over 1 million article records then. But that is because it's all automatic stuff. There's no manual coding involved. It's feasible to do that. But for our questions, it's a little bit trickier.
Yeah, no, I fully understand. I see there is a comment in the chat, so perhaps the study can be extended to all databases of journals using constellars for JSTOR and related databases to mass download data to show the differences in studies and language representation with highly esteemed journals and other lesser known ones. So I think it's in the same line as what I had in mind. Yeah,
I really like that idea. I think that would be great. Then one would really, I think, ideally use some kind of automatic extraction of the language under study. And I think there are possibilities if you have like the articles in text format, you might be able to do it automatically. I mean, still there would need to be some checking, or at least, a checking of a small portion of them to have some confidence in what's happening with that automatic extraction. But I think that would be really interesting. And I think what you probably would see is a bit more diversity in so-called lower impact journals, right?
Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat at this moment, and I think we're running a little bit over time as well. But I would like to thank you again. I thought it was a really nice presentation. It was really unfortunate that we had these electricity issues. But yeah, no, I seriously enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Menno, for inviting us, and thanks everyone for listening and for your great comments. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Cool, thank you.